Hi, I'm Pete, and welcome to Just 2 Acres Farm. Outside, it's a howling snowstorm with winds that are supposed to go over 40 miles an hour today. But inside my shop, it's nice and cozy. It's a great day to start putting together this international truck engine. For those of you that are just following the playlist for this truck, it's been a few months because the machine shops have been doing their work. The cylinder head went out to one machine shop, the block went out to another machine shop, and let me show you what they've done. First, the block. The block was hot tanked, all cleaned up. You remember it was just an absolute mess with baked on oil and things. And the number 6 cylinder was the worst. That's the one that the mice or the squirrels had got in, and it was all rusty. Well, originally this was a 3 13/16 bore engine. And the machinist found that he had to take it out to 3 7/8. I think that's 62 thousandths more to remove all of that rust and get a nice smooth bore for the pistons. And he also hatched the cylinders when he was done, so it's ready for the installation of new piston rings on the pistons. I'll crank this over here so you can see the bottom. On the underside, he cleaned everything up, of course, and fit the main bearing caps on and checked for roundness in here. I bought a new old stock set of camshaft bearings. He fit those in. And in general, it just looks like a new block. He did a great job. New parts for this engine are practically non-existent, and everything that I have is new old stock. So when it came to finding new pistons, there weren't any, especially since we bored out the engine a full 16th. So JE Pistons made custom pistons for this. They're forged aluminum pistons. The machinist took care of the order with them. Racing pistons. The pin center to top of piston dimension is the same as the old ones, so I haven't increased compression at all. I have increased displacement a 1/16 of an inch in bore size. The machinist also bored out the pin bushings in here because the piston pins were about 7 thousandths bigger than the old piston pins, so he was able to clean up the bushing without replacing it. He also checked the connecting rod ends for roundness, and you can see where he machined in here to bring them back to round. They were out of round a bit. The cylinder head's under here. You'll see it in more detail later on in the video. The two machinists that did this work were David Richards' machine shop in Newark Valley, New York, who's done a lot of cylinder heads for me. He did the head work. And then doing the block work and taking care of the pistons and all that, Precision Crankworks in Windsor, New York. They both did an excellent job in my opinion. I'll talk about the head a little bit more when we get to putting it on and what work was done to that. I'll show you what the crankshaft looks like. She is beautiful, ground and polished, mains and rod journals. The main bearing journals were ground to 10 under, and the rod bearing journals were ground to 20 under, and that was based just on what bearings I could find. And here are my new bearings. These are the main bearings in this box, TRW, and then for rod bearings I had to collect up 3 different manufacturers to find 6 sets of them. Federal Mogul, look at that old box. I think these are dated 1942 on the bearing shells. McQuay Norris and 1 TRW. So these are 20 under and these mains are 10 under. Gasket sets were relatively easy to find. I got them from Olson's Gaskets out of Washington State, and I was impressed. This head gasket looks new old stock to me. It's got an IH stamp on it, and it's a good old metal clad gasket. I prefer to work with them when I can find them. And then the manifold gasket, the exhaust and intake manifold gasket, also has an IH stamp on it. Someplace here, right there. So I believe that these are new old stock. And this box has my bottom end gasket kit in it. Some of these gaskets they make in-house, I believe, just the felt gaskets. That's the front main seal, all the miscellaneous gaskets. The oil pan gaskets are actually funky on this. They come in multiple pieces. You'll see that later on. Front cover gasket. They're all here, or at least they should be all here. Lastly, before I get started, and I apologize for talking so much in this video, I just wanted to bring everybody up to speed. I have an original serviceman's manual for this line of trucks. Actually, this was written for the series before it, the L series of trucks, and the R's came right after the L's and were very similar to the L's. So it contains addenda for the R series trucks. It's a big fat book, and it's got incredible detail about everything in the truck, the wiring, the braking, the different transmissions used, the different rear ends used, the suspension. Everything's in here. There's a whole section on the engines. Now, when it comes to the engines, they used so many different engines, and there were so many different models of trucks in each line that there's a bunch of different groups. Engine group 1 is silver diamond engines. We've got super blue diamond engines, super red diamond engines, even a Continental engine that they used in these trucks. And then as an addenda is the engine that I have, which is a super black diamond 282, short form is a BD 282, sleeveless engine. And then past this, you've got all of the specs for the different engines, and then sections for each line of engines. Now, there isn't a section on my particular super black diamond because that was an addendum to the book, but they're substantially similar to the super blue diamond engines. Most notably, they're also denoted by BD, but the BD 269 is substantially similar. So I'm going to be using a lot of the maintenance information and the rebuild information from that line of engines because the super black diamond doesn't have its own section in this book. Here's the Continental. Well, let's get started. Pull these crank caps off. This looks like a good storage bench. These are my main bearing shells. These are Cleveite bearings. They'll usually come with a mark on them when you have replacements with the manufacture date. These say 9/77, September 1977, and then the mark 10 under. These three front bearings are the same, and the rear is the thrust bearing, so that's different. I just happen to start with number 2, put the other half of the shell in the cap. Notice in the bearing shell sets I've got one with a groove and a hole in it and one that's just plain. The one with the hole in the groove goes on this side because you've got a hole right here that's the oil feed hole to the bearing, and you can see this round tube right here. Well, it's drilled through the casting into the main oil gallery. Yes, it's a gallery, not a galley. It's not a kitchen on a ship. It's a long space with multiple holes coming out of it, a gallery. And so this bearing goes down, and then the other shell fits into the cap like this. And if you have any doubts about which way the bearing faces, if it's not marked, and these were never marked, I've never found a mark on them, you can see where the machining was from cutting this slot. So the bearing goes on that way. Now for the rearmost main bearing, and when I say main bearing, people say main bearing just because it's the bearing that holds the crankshaft. It's the main bearing of the engine, I guess. The rear bearing is different because it takes thrust. It takes force pushing on it this way and this way. And to take that thrust, I have these. These are thrust bearings that go on each side of this. Fourth main bearing cap. The thrust bearing shells go on just like this, and a lot of later engines, these are one-piece bearings that just come all in one piece with the thrust bearing part of this bearing. So there's 4 pieces total, and until the crankshaft is in, they're kind of loose, so it's kind of all going to have to go in at once. However, before I go any further, I want to set this crankshaft in place dry. She's pretty heavy. This is a careful operation. I'm just going to pick one journal. This happens to be the number 2 journal, and I'm going to check the clearance on it. The guy that grinds crankshafts does an awesome job. I'm more worried about the new old stock bearings. This is green plastic gauge meant for measuring 1/1000ths of an inch to 3/1000ths of an inch bearing clearance based on crush. Torque spec on these is 105 foot-pounds. And we take them right back off and see what we've got. See where it crushed my plastic gauge right here? You just take the gauge on the side of the wrapper, and I'm between, well, that's 2/1000ths on that end. It tapers a little bit. 2 to 3/1000ths is what my clearance is based on crush. 1 to 4/1000ths is the spec in the book for clearance, so at 2 to 3/1000ths, I'm right in there where I need to be. This is Permatex Ultra Slick Engine Assembly Lube. I love this stuff because it's sticky. It stays in place. And just as a bonus, it looks like strawberry jam. I'm going to put some on the back side of these truss bearings to stick them in place until the crankshaft holds them in. Kind of like you would do with grease, except this stuff is super sticky. The reason I set this in dry to begin with was so I could get an accurate reading on the bearing clearances. Now it goes in lubed. Assemble the thrust bearing, the rear bearing. There's a little dowel on the bearing cap that holds these in place, as well as my sticky lube here. Make sure everything's settled in all right. Feels silky smooth. The camshaft's next. I'm oiling up the journals that it goes into. Usually I put the camshaft in first, but this crankshaft is quite heavy, and I thought, well, it'd be easier to align the timing marks on the crank and the camshaft if I put the crankshaft in first, because the camshaft's a lot lighter. More finger painting with strawberry jam. This is like playing Operation. That dot is a timing mark. It has to align with the dot on the camshaft, which is down to the bottom. Let's get over one tooth. Oh, it's got to go over one more tooth. There we go. And they're in alignment. Yep. Whoops, check that. I forgot something. Yep, it happens. This front plate goes on before the camshaft, and before the front plate goes on, the gasket has to go on it. This is Permatex high-tack gasket sealant. There's one bolt on the inside here behind the cam gear. I put a little blue Loctite or blue thread locker on it. Make sure it doesn't come loose. And then I have a few temporaries here just to hold it in place till I get the second half of the front cover on later. Now the camshaft can go in. The camshaft flange hooks on through these holes right back here. Only got to line them up. Gotta find them. I thought I had them. There's one. Boy, I'm having a heck of a time here. I put the bolt in the wrong hole. I got to move it over one. I guess I should have stayed at a Motel 6 last night. I should have noticed that. You can see the mark where the flange from the camshaft mounts on. I had the bolt in that hole. It's supposed to go over there. Now they line up. Again, blue Loctite on these. There's no torque spec given, and you use your torque wrench elbow to get them right, and the blue Loctite helps make sure they don't come loose. That feels good. I have little to no end play, but it's not tight. If I turn it, it turns easily. Around here at the opposite end of the engine, at the other end of the camshaft, there's a cover plate. And usually there would be a soft plug here that covers the end of the camshaft. But here we get a plate and a gasket. Now I can start installing pistons. This is one of the old pistons. Remember, this was their flaw. They blew through. Must have gotten too hot and blown through. And it always occurred above this slot. I assume this slot is for expansion. The old piston has 3 compression rings and then 1 oil ring around the bottom, 1 3-piece oil ring. The new pistons only have 3 rings. They've got 2 compression rings, and then they have 1 3-piece oil ring around the bottom. And you can see they're much shorter. The skirt's shorter on the new pistons. I think they used to run these long skirt old pistons thinking they had longer life, which is probably true because you've got more wear surface here as the piston wants to rotate in the bore. I'm sure that these will work great. A little assembly is required. We got to put the rings on, so I'll clamp it in the vise. Ring packs come like this, the rings for 1 piston in 1 pack, and they should be stacked in order. The bright edge ring is the fire ring, the first ring to go on, and then we have a second compression ring, and then we have our 3-piece oil ring here. You lube the piston up real good, just motor oil. I put some oil on the ring. I start from the bottom. These oil rings are pretty simple because they're so thin, they're easy to just get on here. So this bottom ring that I'm calling the oil ring, it's what wipes the oil off of the cylinder wall so that it doesn't wind up in the combustion chamber when it fires. It keeps the engine from burning oil. You know, I've forgotten something, and that is that if you put the middle piece in first, it's easier to put the others in after. Yep, I think. That's my memory. I don't do this every day. We'll get out of there. And of course you always stagger your end gaps by thirds or so. The whole assembly, all the rings will rotate as the engine's running. But if you start them staggered, hopefully they'll stay staggered when they're rotating. Now we have the 2 compression rings. Bright one goes on top. There's a dot right there, which means that goes up. A little oil on her. This is a cheapy ring expander that I use. Works alright. To get it down in the slot. And then the top ring's easy because it says top in little letters on it, so we know which side of that goes up. Easy peasy. altogether, by the way, the weather outside has not improved one bit. It's really blowing out there. You might have noticed that these new rings are quite a bit thinner in height than these rings, these old rings. The machinist said that'll decrease drag on the piston and allow the engine to gain about 60 more horsepower. Less friction anyway, and I think that they've come a long way with alloys, and these rings, even though they're thinner, should have a long life. I hope. That all oiled up, we can put on the ring compressor. Number 1 piston journal all the way to the bottom on the crankshaft so we don't whack it. Lube up the cylinder walls some. Here's our piston number 1 marked right there, and we want the mark to go toward the camshaft always, so it goes to that side. Roll her over. Here's our new bearing shell. It's marked right there, 20 under. This one doesn't have a date on it that I can see. Anyway, this hole here in the connecting rod goes straight up through the connecting rod and oils the piston pin, which the piston rotates on. Just put the shell right in here. And so we have a hole in the shell that lines up with that supply hole that goes up to the piston pin. You need to float over like that. There we go. This engine is a little strange. See where the tab is that locks the bearing in? That little notch right there keeps the bearing from spinning around when the engine's spinning if it happens to catch. Here's the tab right here on the cap. This is the camshaft side, so it faces this way. So these two line up on these, but on the main bearings, they didn't. The rear main bearing all the way in the other end is biased to go on only one way, and on that one, the tabs were opposite. The cap tab faced one way, the tab that's in the block faced the other way, and it was the same for all the bearings going forward. And I looked at the disassembly video, and that's the way they came out too. It's strange, something I haven't run into before. The instructions that came with the Pistons said to use this ARP Moly lubricant on the bolts to get proper torque out of them. So I will do that. I did not lubricate the main bearing bolts, and I probably should have, but I think they'll be alright. These old engines, they have wide tolerances, that's for sure. 75 foot-pounds on these. How does she turn down in there? Oh yeah, that's nice. Good morning. There's certainly no guilt in working in the shop today. It's about 20 degrees out and the wind's still blowing and the snow's still falling. One of the nice things about working in a small shop, the shop is 16 foot wide by 20 foot long and about 8.5 foot tall. And it's well insulated, R19 in the walls and R40 in the ceiling, and the foundation's insulated too. Is it warms up really quickly, and if I keep the heat on for 2 or 3 days, everything is warm. The surfaces, the slab, it all warms up, and it's something I want to take into account in my new shop as far as having a smaller workspace that you can keep nice and toasty with a minimal amount of energy. I think that today I want to finish the pistons and get the rocker arm assemblies taken apart and cleaned up. I haven't done that yet. I felt bad about not lubing the main bearing cap bolts before torquing them, so this morning I took them all apart and retorqued them, lubed them up and retorqued them. And I want to do a few checks and then we'll zip right along through the rest of the piston assembly and installation. First thing I want to check here is my ring end gap. You know, I'm assuming that these are all going to be just fine, but just for peace of mind, so you slide a ring into the bore like this, and this happens to be the topmost ring, which is going to see the most expansion. Push it square with the piston upside down. Look at the table that came with the pistons. Let's see, high performance street strip, no. Street moderate turbo nitrous, maybe. Late model stock, I think so. Circle track drag race, nope. Nitrous race only, not for this truck. Blown race only, no. I guess I'll go with late model stock. So it's bore diameter times 5 thousandths. My bore diameter is 3.875, 3 7/8 times 5 thousandths. I should have a 19 thousandths end gap at this piston ring. 19,000 doesn't fit in there, but if I go to 15 thousandths, it fits in there. So I'm glad I checked these because they need to be filed, which is kind of a pain. I didn't plan on having to do this, but seeing as they're racing pistons, they probably allow for some customization. I know that the bore size versus piston size is good because the machinist did check that and ordered the pistons accordingly. So we'll just file it down a little bit and recheck it and do it till it's right. Of course, the danger if you don't do this step is that when this ring gets hot and expands, it'll bind, and then you've got all kinds of problems. I filed the rings for number 2 piston, assembled it, ready to put in. I'm going to use the cool old rod bearings on this one, the Federal Moguls. 20 under. I thought I saw a date on these. It was very old, but I guess it was one of the other bearings. I don't see a date on these. I'm going to check clearance on this bearing, just like I did with the crankshaft. We'll just check one. Spec clearance on these is a little under 1 thousandth, 7 thousandths actually, to a little over 3 thousandths. So it's back with the green plastic gauge. Torqued. Should be between 1 and 3 someplace. They're 2. That one's at 2. 2 thousandths clearance, so we're good. I've got to take piston number 1 back out to file the rings, and then I have to file the rings for the other pistons, install the other pistons. While I do that, I'm going to put you guys in a time warp. Cue the music.
A legend from the past is born again at last to rumble over mountains and the plains. From the golden age of steam, an engine seldom seen by those who never lived in bygone days. Big Boy was her name and went on to railroad fame as the largest engine on the UP line. The last of all her class, she survives from out the past to show the power of steam in modern time. Roll on, big boy, roll on, big boy, rumbling across the northern plains. Roll on, big boy, roll on, big boy, climbing up the Wasatch Mountain Range. In 1959, they took her off the line and wrote her off as progress for the time. No dry eye could be found in jungles or in towns where once Big Boy had rolled when in her prime. From the junkyards of the past, 4014 is the last to carry on the legacy of steam. 488 and 4 and a part of railroad lore. She roars from out the past like some lost dream. Roll on.
All the pistons are in. It looks good. Ezra's been supervising. Next job is to get this rocker arm assembly cleaned up, and it was in pieces. I reassembled it into a whole, and it looks to me like these rockers are all the same. There's a number on them I can make sure, so I can pull this all apart and then reassemble it after cleaning. It's the best way to get it clean. It's just repeating parts: support block, washer, rocker arm, spring, another rocker arm, splits in the middle like that. Yeah, this is pretty gunky. I'll take it apart and clean it up. Oh, pieces always fall on the floor. Oh, there's a washer there. That's odd. We'll have to remember that. There's another one there. You'll remember how it goes back together, right? Remind me. This engine has oil cooked on every interior surface. Worse than any tractor engine I've worked on. This is the tube that all the rocker arms mount on and the springs and such, and it's hollow. And you can see how the oiling works here. If I plug up the end of it, there's an oil hole at each rocker arm, or a pair of them, and they feed it. What I'm doing here is cleaning one piece at a time so I can keep them all in order. So the oil comes out of the tube here and oils each one of these, and there's holes in the bushings that squirt oil up to the top here, and it kind of drips down, and it'll oil both sides on here as well as the bushing getting oiled. And then typically it varies depending on engine, but one of the feet, one or more of the feet, I suspect it's the two end ones here, has an oil hole in it, and sometimes there's a hollow bolt. I'll have to look when I put it together. But anyway, that oil hole feeds into here, and then it can feed into the end of this tube. Day 3. Yesterday afternoon I finished cleaning up the pieces of the rocker arms, and they're ready to put back together. And in preparation for putting on the head, I cleaned up the push rods, all the head bolts. There's 24 of them. I suspect there may be more in this engine, a gas engine, than there is in the D282 diesel tractor engines. Oil pickup, engine side cover, tappet cover. There's the valve tappets or lifters over there. Rear main seal parts over there. These crankshaft rear main seals are just like the ones on the international tractors of the era, made out of a soft metal, two-piece, and they always get deformed where the bolts have pulled down on them. So I just barely started sanding this one off, but I'm going to sand it flat, and then it'll be ready to install. Let's put this rocker arm set back together. This is the middle pedestal. Turns out after inspection, this front pedestal is what provides lube to the whole assembly. There's a hollow bolt that goes down in the block and connects to the oil gallery running along the side of the block. This is the front of the head right here, and if you look carefully, this hole is slightly larger in diameter than this hole, and this bolt goes in that hole. It's got a open bottom and a hole in the bottom, and then 2 holes that squirt oil into the annular space around the bolt because it's loose in the hole. And that hole corresponds to this hole at the front of the engine. I'm sure you can't see it, but if you look carefully, that hole shoots all the way down along here and connects into the oil gallery along here. Let's test fit this and see how we did. Of course, you got spring pressure that holds everything together. I think we got it right. It looks pretty good. That's where this video ends. I naively thought, I always forget, that I could put this whole engine together in one video, but it is a lot of careful work. It takes time, so I'm going to have to break it up. In the next video, I'll be putting the head on, putting the valve train together, getting the valve lash adjusted, pan, oil pan, valve cover, front cover, all that stuff, and we'll march forward. I can't wait to hear this engine run again. It's going to sound great. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.